At the end of October, to be clear, I mean 2024, I celebrated a birthday, I was getting ready to go to a trip to England. I thought I would preach a sermon series. I got this idea. I could preach a sermon series on democracy because it was becoming increasingly clear to me, and had been for a while, that the Wendigos were definitely stirring. And no matter what happened that first week of November, it was pretty clear to me we were going to probably need to see them more clearly. At least I think that's what happened in October. It kind of seems like it was a whole other time of life. Does anyone else feel that way about October? Do you remember October? Yeah? I think it was in this lifetime, October, this dimension of reality. The words of the poet Claudine Rankin really spoke to me, because I think we've been asking ourselves those questions a lot. What did he just say? Did I really hear what I think I just heard? And after weeks of that, time is sort of stretched out, as if sort of through funhouse mirrors. But here's the thing I know, not too many months after that I was wrong about some of the things I believed way back there in October of 2024. In that ancient time of October, I had some ideas and beliefs in what human beings were capable of doing to one another that have been challenged in these days. And I might have been just a little bit over-optimistic that people would want, as much as I did, to understand why we were in this moment. That they would want to come to a sermon series about this. It is not just a strategy to get more people to come to our second service today that I decided to keep my commitment to do this last part of this series. It's because I believe if there has ever been a time when we have been called upon to do what it is our faith requires us to do, that time is now. So I'm not preaching about politics. I'm preaching about the ways we hold our values in a world that increasingly challenges them. So I think that's important to think about. And in these last months, I think many of us have experienced moments of needing to release something, needing to say, well, maybe I need to rethink that. And that can be across a whole range of spectrums. And one of the things I look forward to in this community is trying to find more ways that we can have those conversations together. I think we've all experienced moments where it feels as if our individual actions seem a lot less effective than we'd want them to be. Has anyone had that experience in the last couple weeks, in the eternity since October? So I want us to think about that. And I want us to think about it in very traditional religious terms of values. Values of affirming the right of all to flourish. And also, those are values. That's our idea of good. And then also that other very religious concept of evil. In our faith, I think the way we think about evil are the things that divide us, the things that other us. And since that first week of November, we have heard a great deal of othering. People, including those immigrating here for shelter from repressive regimes around the world. We've heard that our neighbors in Mexico and Canada and our once allies in Europe are now the cause of our demise, not our own decisions. We have watched the deportation of those who support our economy through their labor and the reification of a very, very, very small group of people who are trying to kick down any barriers to their own insatiable Wendigo appetites. How clear it has become that our nation's current direction is now dominated by a few, very wealthy people. You might call them oligarchs. And that those interests are having a rather disproportionate impact on our government policy, moving our collective ideal away from the idea of serving the most to serving the interests of the fewest. from ideals of inclusion to a pure form of unenlightened self-interest. And we have seen this accelerated not just since the eternity of October, but really over decades. And yet, more so when a decade and a half ago, in the case of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, our nation effectively ended restrictions on campaign contributions by corporations and thus exploded the influence of money on politics, right? Robert Reich, who was the Secretary of Labor, has pointed out that when those restrictions were taken out, corporations almost had no choice but to just keep investing more and more money in a realm that they never used to invest as much in. It became an escalation. So these times allow us to release the idea that we're going to find one perfect way of moving forward, because what we're facing is a lot of different things, as we've talked about over the time. But we could specifically, I think, address two of the wendigos of more progressive culture, which ethicist Sharon Welsh identifies: the trap of endless struggles over strategies and tactics that keep us from actually acting together and collectively, and the allure of inertia, which says, because nothing is perfect, we just won't do anything. And eventually, we'll just count on things coming out right in the end. She says we must be aware of our particular failings as we are part of the constitutive dangers of conservatism. Without awareness, we as progressive people too end up reinforcing systems of injustice, because none are immune from those forms of imbalance, and we are far more aware to contain these dangers if we are aware of them. In other words, if we know the wendigos in our midst, we're more likely to take those measures that can counter them. One of those wendigos is very much the power of othering, the power of tactics that distract us from the real economic and societal challenges we face. Othering, like the othering of queer people, especially those who are transgender, while unelected and unaccountable people tear down the public infrastructure we have built together over centuries and decades for the education, for the environment, for our economy, to progress, to protect against interests which no longer see themselves tied to any accountability other than the bottom line. While medical and other care for those most in need gets put on the chopping blocks, what we are being focused on is a small group of people who want only to be able to be who they are. It is a tactic of othering. We have seen invasion of the system to save for retirement, fueled by our own earnings called Social Security, all in the name of free enterprise, and yet that enterprise is only free for a more limited number of people in this nation. We used to talk about the 1%, but now they talk about the 0.01%. And that's something to think about. And we need to think about where our interest is being directed versus where we actually need to look. We have heard a lot of othering of women. We have watched the glorification of systems that would take away women's rights to bodily autonomy and even economic autonomy as a return to an ideal model where women are protected by men. Meanwhile, the same oligarchs are working in our name to support repressive regimes around the world, traveling to interfere in other elections. A range of observers, from plucky alternative media like Democracy Now! To Harvard's Kennedy School, which is not exactly the outside group, they're sounding the alarm that blatant rule by a small handful of billionaires threatens our democracy in ways we have rarely seen. And it is important to know that people have been sounding this alarm for decades. Robert Reich has been talking about supercapitalism for over 20 years. But now, what others call hypercapitalism just seems to be expanding and expanding as we all have been sucked in a little bit more, and I think the pandemic heightened this, into that wendigo of consumerism, right? We need the things we need them right when we need them, we need to not have to drive across town to get them. Lots of things like that, Wendigos, messages in our minds. The Kennedy School study found this. 10 years ago, 2 political scientists took a data set and a small army of researchers, and they set out to determine a really important question, whether the US could still credibly call itself a democracy. That was 10 years ago, a decade ago. They used 1,800 policy proposals that they looked at over 30 years to see what they actually did and who they actually helped. And what they found was devastating. That political outcomes overwhelmingly favor very wealthy people, corporations, and business groups, and that the influence of ordinary citizens was at, quote, a non-significant near zero level. The US, they concluded, was not a democracy at all, but a functional oligarchy already, and this was a decade ago. And that is important because we just found that now what the 1% owns is more than 90% of the stocks traded across this nation. It's important to see how this has been consolidated. So in the words of the hymn that our choir helped teach us this morning by J.A. Oliver and Miguel Manzano, when the poor ones who have nothing share with strangers, when the thirsty water gives us unto us all, when the wounded in their weakness strengthen others, then we know that God still goes that road with us. There are lots of models out there to think about, to help us feel and release that sense of powerlessness. In the last weeks, I've been revisiting the work of ethicist Sharon Welsh, who I had the great privilege to work with for over a decade. And she talks about some of the necessary strategies for this time, including denouncing systems of injustice, as many of us are doing. Remember, there's cardboard in the Borton Hall. Inclusion of voices and experiences of all people, especially those whose power has been marginalized and excluded. And also, though, what she says, the third wave, building what may be right. Building what may be right. Notice there's some ambiguity in there, because the ambiguity is one of the things we have to take up, right? To experiment among us with building structures that may be part of the solution, even if we don't know if they will work. Building them in the private sector, through social enterprise, building them in the academic sector through what she calls engaged scholarship, building them among us through mutual aid and ways that we can be together. There are so many ways, she says, we can take this up. To counter what we've talked about in these sermons on democracy, polarization and false news, the rise of the wealthy, the need to continue to look at the ways that we have gradually let our democracy be chipped away with because of that Wendigo of inertia, right? There are so many strategies, and we do not need to debate. We can release needing to debate which is the right one, because which is the right one for us is the right one. Whether we feel called to boycott, to protest, which I understand almost shut down Walnut Creek yesterday, whether we feel called to the practice of justice making by our own individual personal choices. We have many things we can do besides falling victim to the othering that says that it's immigrants and trans people, Mexican, Canadians, and Europeans that are somehow the cause of the problems among us. The truth of our times may be that we have more power as consumers than we do as citizens at this point in our history. And if we think back on it, if we think about our intentions, there is something happening here because more and more people are thinking about the choices they make with their dollars. I'm going to tell you, I had a long list of topics that never got into any of these sermons. And I'm grateful for those who come to the Love-Centered Democracy class, so I get a chance to talk about some of the other ones with all of you. There are a lot more Wendigos out there that we need to name, that we need to know how to counter. But there are also so many strategies for evading their reach. We have to let go of the idea that there's only a one-step or two-step solution to get where we so desperately want to go. We have to let go of the idea that we are too fragile to stay in the struggle for the long term. Sharon Welsh says, "Our better ideals are straightforward: a commitment to generative interdependence, practices of respect, reciprocity, and gratitude, better shaping of our civic, professional, personal, and economic lives." We can think about what we buy, who we support with our time, how we make our livelihoods. We can support new kinds of enterprises that are trying to be impactful, empathetic, and eco-conscious. We can cultivate a list of the people and organizations which are going to bear those seeds, and we can commit to make this place one of them. We can help support each other through mutual aid, because love-centered democracy will continue to exist if we ensure that it does. We can keep its seeds germinating through our own choices as consumers, citizens, and neighbors. We can continue to deepen our understanding of what will make it work and let it thrive. When that is ready, we will plant the seeds we have so carefully nurtured. That may be the best work we can do in this time. Thank you.